The Houston Texans had a surprisingly awesome 2023 season, and with that awesome season has come with some newfound expectations for this team in 2024. So in today's video, I want to talk about the Houston Texans and why they may or may not be a little bit overrated this upcoming season. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Houston Texans and why they may or may not be overrated, and by doing so, we're going to break it up into 3 different segments. We'll start off by talking about why the Houston Texans may be overrated, and then after that, somewhere in the middle of the video, we'll start talking about the opposite of that. We're going to be talking about why the Houston Texans are in fact not overrated, and then at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys my personal opinion about whether or not the Houston Texans have become an overrated team. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off by talking about why the Houston Texans have become a tad bit overrated. And we'll start off by looking at the general roster, and then we'll start looking at some more bigger picture things. And when looking at the roster, there really is not a lot of really bad things to point at. The team has talent in basically every single position, but there are some glaring issues that I do see on this defense. Starting off on the defensive line, I have some big time question marks about the defensive tackle room. I do think there is some talent here with Danico Autry, Foley Fatukasi, hopefully I said that right, and Tim Settle. I think there is some general talent there, and I do think they have some good depth, but I don't really know if they have necessarily a starting caliber guy, maybe outside of Danico Autry, who is a pretty good pass rusher. My big concern for this team is that they did have a pretty solid defensive tackle room last year, and this year I feel like they took a small step back, and I am just a little bit worried about what that may mean in terms of being able to stuff the run. I think if this team does have at least a top 16 defense next year, they're going to easily be one of the better teams in the league, but I do just have some general concerns about the defensive tackle room. I know there's a bunch of guys who could definitely play, but I just don't know if there's anybody who's like a bona fide star in that position. The next position that I do have a big time question mark at is going to be with the cornerback 2 position. Right now, your starting cornerbacks are projected to be Derek Stingley Jr., Jeff Okudah, and Miles Bryant. Miles Bryant will likely be more of your slot / nickel cornerback type of guy, with Derek Stingley being the biggest and best cornerback on the team. But then you have Jeff Okudah, who last year was dealing with some injuries and throughout his career has been kind of up and down. Obviously, he was drafted super high just a few years ago and was thought to be a generational talent, but unfortunately, it just really has not panned out for him. He's had some good moments, but oftentimes those good moments have been stuffed by injuries, so for him to be your starting cornerback this upcoming season is a bit of a question mark. Now, fortunately for this team, they do have some pretty decent depth within that position. You brought in Kamari Lassiter in this last draft, and I do think he's very talented, but I just don't know quite yet if he's ready to go. I will say if Jeff Okudah does go out, I would likely assume that Kamari will be stepping in as that starter full time, which I do think he could easily do so and actually play pretty well. But if Kamari's not ready, you could always move Desmond King to that other cornerback position. You also have guys like CJ Henderson, Chris Boyd, and Mike Ford. So I do feel as if this team does have some injuries within that cornerback room. They do have some guys who can fill in and play some minutes. I just don't really know how I feel about Jeff Okudah still being a starter in this league, given his injury history and just given his performance lately. But for me, as I said earlier, the roster is pretty fine in totality. I'm not really too concerned about any one position. But that brings me a bit more to my bigger picture issues with this Houston Texans team, because the general consensus regarding this Texans team is that they're going to be, at the worst, a second round exit in the playoffs this year. And I've seen very many people say that this team is going to make it to the AFC Championship game and even potentially make it to a Super Bowl. But I kind of find that a little bit hard to believe given how much talent is within this AFC. In the AFC, you have the likes of the Buffalo Bills, the Miami Dolphins, the New York Jets. Then within the AFC South, there are some ultra-talented teams in the Indianapolis Colts and the Jacksonville Jaguars. But the biggest threat to this Houston Texans team might just be the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC West. So just that alone, you're looking at potentially 7 to 8, maybe even 10 teams that are all playoff contenders. And not only are they just playoff contenders, but a good number of them are also championship contenders. Again, looking at the teams here, you get the Bills, the Ravens, Bengals, Browns, Jets, Chiefs, and the Texans, who are all championship contenders, and I'm not even throwing in the likes of the Miami Dolphins or the Pittsburgh Steelers or the Jacksonville Jaguars. So there's going to be a bunch of teams competing for a limited amount of spots within the playoffs, and while I do fully expect the Houston Texans to be one of those teams that does make it to the playoffs, I do think they're going to have a pretty lucky path to make it all the way to the Super Bowl. I think the pathway for them to get to the Super Bowl is by avoiding the likes of the Baltimore Ravens or the Kansas City Chiefs, and also not dealing with any sort of injuries. A 100% healthy Houston Texans team versus a 100% healthy Chiefs or Ravens team is not going to win. The Chiefs are a better team with, in my opinion, a better quarterback, with, in my opinion, a better head coach, and while I do feel like the Texans could easily give them a run for their money, the Chiefs will likely win that game when it comes down to playoff time. And a lot of those same thoughts and principles also do apply to the Baltimore Ravens. I know that the Houston Texans took a bunch of big steps forward this offseason, but the Ravens are still a loaded roster who, yeah, took some steps back on defense, but also took some steps forward on the offensive side of things. And I haven't even mentioned the likes of the Bengals, who are going to be coming back healthy with freaking Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. Not to mention the Buffalo Bills could still be a top contending team, and who knows what the Jets are going to look like come playoff time if Aaron Rodgers is playing like Aaron Rodgers. So again, I want to reiterate, the Texans are going to be awesome and they're going to compete with those teams big time, but it's hard for me to buy a whole lot of stock into this Texans team being a championship contender when they have to face these teams on a week-to-week basis. Which that brings me to my next point, which is going to be my last point before we switch over to the more positive side of things about why this team is not overrated. But I think a big reason why this Texans team might be becoming a little bit overrated is because of the general expectations for this team. The Texans were great last year. They won the division fair and square and they were awesome. But with those came a lot of extremely high expectations in just year number 2 of CJ Stroud. This sort of reminds me a little bit of like the 2016 Dallas Cowboys. Because in 2016, the Cowboys were ridiculously good. They won their division, they were like 12-4, and then they lost in the playoffs in pretty unfair fashion because they went up against Aaron Rodgers in like the last play of that game. They won that game. And for the Texans, you lost to a team like the Ravens, so there's some similarities to these two teams. And then what happened the next year? The 2017 Dallas Cowboys were a pretty big disappointment. And you can look at a lot of things that happened that offseason and you could say, well, the Texans have been avoiding those things at all costs. And I do agree. But at the end of the day, the play on the field was still the play on the field. The Cowboys went from being this awesome team that surprised everyone to being this team that was trying to figure things out and had a lot of question marks. So for this Texans team, you came out last year and surprised a bunch of people, and good for them. They got a lot better this offseason. They added a bunch of really awesome players, but can they find ways to be a brand new team this upcoming season and continue to surprise more people? One of the biggest issues I had with that Cowboys team was they weren't aggressive in the free agency, which the Houston Texans have been, but maybe more importantly, they didn't really adapt and change their game plan. It just was the same game plan over and over again, and teams learned how to beat them. For this Texans team, I kind of feel like they have to do a little bit of that. They did the one thing that I thought they needed to do, which was to be aggressive this offseason by finding a bunch of big upgrades. But I also feel like next year you got to change things up a little bit with your scheme. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to change everything, and I do think they will change it because they have some awesome coaches. I do just want to throw it out there that the expectations are even higher for this Texans team this upcoming season, so anything less than what they did last year is going to be considered a disappointment. Alrighty, but I gave you guys a couple of ideas as to why they may be overrated. Those are just some general opinions that a lot of people have had, but let's get into a lot of other opinions about why this team may not be overrated. When looking at this roster, there is a lot of really good things to look at. This is the biggest reason why they're not an overrated team. This roster is ridiculously talented. Offensively speaking, you have a trio of wide receivers in Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell, and all three of these guys could probably be receiver ones on most teams. Stephon Diggs was obviously the receiver one for the Buffalo Bills, and right now, a healthy Tank Dell and a healthy Nico Collins could honestly be receiver ones for this team as well. They're also complemented by some really stud running backs like Joe Mixon and maybe Dameon Pierce if he's healthy and playing back to what we thought he could be. And alongside them is a pretty good offensive line that should be healthy this upcoming season. Their combination of tackles in Tunsil and Howard are two of the better tackle duos in the league, and I'm excited to see Titus Howard back at that right tackle spot. Then your interior is back with guys like Kenyon Green, Juice Scruggs, and Shaq Mason, a nice young duo at left guard and center. We'll see if Kenyon Green can live up to the expectations we had for him when he came out of the draft. And of course, we can't talk about this offense without talking about last year's Offensive Rookie of the Year, CJ Stroud. He was absolutely ridiculously good last year, one of the best rookie seasons that I've seen in quite some time. He was a little bit slow off the gun to start off the season last year, but after that Tampa Bay Buccaneers game, this dude just turned it up to a brand new level. And I fully do expect that CJ Stroud will in fact play like CJ Stroud did last year, but even better and take his game to another level. CJ Stroud is a workaholic. He's a very good player. He's a very talented player. He's got basically every attribute that you want within a quarterback, and I do think it's going to show itself on the field next year, and he's going to have an awesome MVP-like season. If Stroud has that MVP-like season, we're talking about a team that has quite literally an unlimited amount of potential. I love Stroud, and I think that he's going to be awesome, and I think there is an argument to be made that by the end of next year, if he plays as good as we think he can be, he might already be a top 5 quarterback in the league. Offensively speaking, I talked about it in the last portion. This team has added a bunch of really key additions along this defense. Bringing in guys like Danielle Hunter, Azeez Al-Shaair, and Jeff Okudah. These are guys who should bring instant impact players on this defense. Defensive line-wise, I'm extremely excited to see the trio of Danielle Hunter, Will Anderson Jr., and Derek Barnett. Derek Barnett, while not necessarily blowing you away with the statistics, had a really awesome kind of revival to his career. And now he's playing alongside some really dominant pass rushers and Will Anderson Jr., who I fully expect to take the next step next year. And then Danielle Hunter, who when healthy is a dominant defensive lineman. You have a linebacking trio of Christian Harris, Azeez Al-Shaair, and Henry To'oTo'o. And I think that might just be my favorite linebacking trio in the NFL. I really am excited to see what they can do in this Danico system. And then secondary wise, I did have my fair share of complaints, but I do feel as if there's enough talent to get the job done. So in totality, this is an extremely loaded roster with an extremely talented quarterback leading the way. But another fortunate thing that may cause this team to not be overrated next year is the fact that their schedule is fairly favorable. Now, I will admit there are some tough games in this road. They have the likes of the Detroit Lions, the Jets, the Bills. They have Minnesota, they have the Cowboys, they have Miami, Kansas City, and Baltimore, but I think a lot of those games are fairly favorable, and I also do think the layout of these games are also extremely favorable. Their first 7 weeks are all fairly easy games. They have the Colts and the Bills as their 2 hardest games. They also do have Chicago and Jacksonville and Minnesota and Green Bay, who are all tough matchups, but I do expect the Texans to be favored in almost all of these games. And so coming out of week 7, if they could be 5-2, I think they'll be looking pretty sharp. Then they have a nice little 4-game stretch against some really good teams. All of these teams are probably going to be in the playoffs or likely going to be trying to make the playoffs. In week 8, you have the Colts. Week 9, you have the Jets. Week 10, you have the Lions. And week 11, you have the Dallas Cowboys. If you can go 2-2 in that stretch and end that stretch off looking about 9-3 or 9-4 or whatever it may be, I think you're looking pretty sharp. Then in weeks 12 and 13, you have the Titans and the Jaguars, 2 fairly easy matchups. I do expect them to basically dominate this division, especially the likes of the Titans and the Jaguars. But then you have a week 14 bye, which may either help you or it may hurt you. Sometimes having a super late bye week can honestly hurt you because it's so late in the season, but at the same time, it gives you a much needed rest right before your toughest stretch of games. Because after the bye in week 15, you have the Miami Dolphins, then you have the Chiefs, then the Ravens, and then Tennessee in week 18. I think a realistic expectation for this Texans team is to go somewhere between 11-6, 12-5, and 13-4. This schedule is, in my opinion, fairly favorable because a lot of your harder games are matched up in sort of small spurts throughout your season. You start off the early portion of your season against some really winnable matchups, and as I said earlier, up until about week 8, it's fairly easy. And then when you do have a couple of hard games, they're hard games in a row, so you just have to keep up your competitive nature for a couple weeks, and then you can get back to where you were going up against some bad teams. You have a stretch between the Colts, Jets, Lions, and Cowboys, and then you have the Titans and the Jaguars, so it's kind of a tough couple games, and then you have a couple easy ones. So I think all in all, the fact that you're favored in a lot of these games this year, you have a favorable schedule, you have a talented roster, I think there's really reasonable expectations to be had about this team and why they could be an awesome team next year. I think another reason why, and we'll briefly cover it before I give you guys my official opinion on this case, is that Danico is an awesome head coach, and I think he's going to continue to develop. You also have Bobby Slowick, who likely will be a head coach at some point, who's a genius offensive coordinator. And I think as long as your game plans are okay and your roster is as talented as it is, you're going to be fine. And I do think this Texans team has the capability of being totally fine. So, all right, it's opinion time. What do I personally think? Well, me personally, I don't think this team is overrated at all. I think this team is honestly going to be pretty awesome next year. I think they're kind of basically a lock to make it to at least the second round last year. We saw what this team was able to do in year 1 of CJ Stroud and year 1 of Danico, just in 1 year where they made it to the second round of the playoffs. And yeah, that Ravens game wasn't the prettiest game in the world to watch, but that was just year 1 rookie season, guys. Now you're heading into year 2 with the full offseason under your belt with an improved roster. I think this team is very likely going to be in the second round next year. And well, as I mentioned, there are several reasons why this team may be overrated. In my opinion, I don't think this team is that overrated. Now, I will say this. If you're saying that this Texans team is going to win the Super Bowl this year, you might be a little bit overrating this team because they're not better than the Chiefs or the Ravens. But if you're in a similar boat to me where you're saying they're probably going to make the playoffs and probably win a couple games in the playoffs, then I think that's a totally fine evaluation of this team. But you guys tell me, what do you guys think about this Houston Texans team? Do you guys think they are overrated? Do you guys think they're maybe underrated? Or do you guys think they're perfectly fine? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.